Welcome to Order from Ashes. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, Director of Century International, and today I'm joined by my old friend and colleague, Michael Wahid Hanna, who's the Director of the U.S. program at International Crisis Group. Michael, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Good to be back with you.
So today we're going to talk about weighty matters of war and peace. And specifically, I wanted Michael to come on and help me sort out two things. One, what exactly has happened in terms of peacemaking around the big regional war that's going on. But more importantly, what I want to focus on is his take on what we've learned about the changing nature of diplomacy and what, if anything, that foretells for the limits or nature of the kinds of peace agreements that end or pause wars in the current moment that we're in historically. Michael, what do you think of this as a lineup of discussion today?
Yeah, there's the immediate pressing issue that I think is on our mind about the war with Iran and whether there's a way out, um, and whether there's a way out that Donald Trump is willing to accept. And there is this broader question. It's something we've grappled with at Crisis Group a lot about this crisis in peacemaking. We don't see diplomacy leading to conflict resolution as often as we used to. Not that that was a common occurrence in the past, but it is certainly something that is notable in this new uh, landscape of proliferating conflict, and that is this crisis in diplomacy and peacemaking.
So top line, so maybe we'll do quick top line, and then I want to survey some of these recent negotiations and conflicts where they stand now, and then spend the bulk of our time on this question of how you're assessing that crisis in peacemaking and how we should think about diplomacy as a tool. So top line. I mean, historically, have the understanding, and this is based on, historical studies and the sort of seminal work by Rand on how Rand Corporation on how conflicts end. Most conflicts end by political settlements, and traditionally that's either outright victory by one side or the other, or a stalemate or sort of frozen conflict that then leads to a negotiated political settlement. So historically and conceptually, this is what we want to avoid total warfare where one party or the other tries to obliterate the other side and kill a lot of civilians in order to achieve a stable outcome. So the only other and the preferable outcome for those of us who want to minimize war and death and destruction is political settlements. And again, my understanding is that traditionally these tend to follow or have tended to follow a pretty standard template, right? Well, once the parties to an armed conflict decide that they can't get what they want by fighting, they turn reluctantly sometimes, but willingly to some kind of third party, usually a major power or a medium-sized power that is perceived to be neutral or trustworthy. Then there's some kind of traditional talks conducted by diplomats and experts. And then at the end, there is a settlement. And that settlement is implemented with the guarantee or oversight of either that sponsoring power or the United Nations or a group of third-party countries acting as some kind of contact group. So if that's right, what do you see? Like, is that still the template that we imagine for a political settlement to an armed conflict, or are we already well into an era where that's not what we should be imagining when we talk about diplomacy?
No, I think there are only so many scenarios, and you've laid out the most common ones. I mean, if we look at the theory of the case, say, when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, it is that latter example you gave of mutually damaging stalemate leading to a reappraisal of wartime goals. Now, at various points, it's been clear that Russia imagines itself to be winning, whatever winning means in this slow war of attrition. But that's part of its calculus. It still sees a way for military victory. Um, the dynamics of that war are changing in such a way that there are some, particularly in Europe, who imagine that the logic of stalemate is now taking precedence, and so that's one example where stalemate can potentially force the parties to the table to try to either salvage or achieve some of their pre-war aims. And of course, the first you mentioned is victory, and this is actually the more common scenario that an ascendant military power um, concretizes its achievements in wartime in the form of some kind of end of conflict arrangement. Um, and of course, I think those are we continue along that path again because there are only so many outcomes available to us when we're thinking about the outcomes of military conflict.
Well, and groups like yours and frankly the work I've done at Century and a lot of our like-minded peers is predicated on this argument that diplomacy is always the better approach uh, than war, right? So we're constantly finding ourselves almost regardless of the theater or the region or the nature of the conflict we're talking about, pleading with policymakers or decision makers to try diplomacy, try talks, and I thought this conversation with you was important to have at this moment because we are, we're really putting that concept forward, not just for the current crisis, but as an organizing principle for what would be better than this sort of Trumpian, rail politic on steroids. And as I'm thinking this through, I really was eager to get a bit of a reality check on really how we should benchmark our expectations for diplomacy. And if we're not ready to make that kind of assessment, just a bit of a survey on what you've learned by being, knee deep in this kind of diplomacy. So maybe if you want to, if you have any thoughts on that, you can jump in with those. And then I wanted to uh, get you to give us a kind of quick tour of the talks underway now with Iran, with Israel and Lebanon, I mean, they've been going on in the background with Russia and Ukraine as a way of benchmarking how diplomacy works in the sort of Kushner-Witkoff era of great power diplomacy.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to step back for a second. I mean, I think one of the things we think about a lot is early warning and conflict avoidance. So it's never a good situation when you're trying to deal with diplomacy to end military conflict, right? I mean, you've already failed in a very important respect. That kind of early warning function. So I would take something like the Horn of Africa at the moment, where you have increasing involvement from outside powers, from the Gulf, increasingly tense alignments around various axes and an interlinkage among conflicts and some clear trigger points, like in Tigray and between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And so, it's not even that early at this point in terms of early warning. There's already been a war between Ethiopia and Tigray in recent years. This is something that is clearly on our radar, and we want it to be on other people's radars. So that's a first thought, that early warning is really important because you don't want to get to military conflict. That's quite a truism, obviously, but we shouldn't lose sight of that. The other is something that we've grappled with a lot, and that is deterrence. There's no way around the idea and the concept in a moment in which great power competition is increasing and in which conflict is proliferating. Those are sort of undeniable facts. If there isn't deterrence in certain settings, then you do run the risk of stronger parties reappraising their strategic calculus and launching wars. I mean, you see this with Putin's calculations vis-a-vis Ukraine, and it's also a big part of the way in which people are thinking about the day after, and that is how can Ukraine in the future create enough deterrence to change the strategic thinking of Russia, and to make, if there is a ceasefire, to make a ceasefire something that can be sustainable and durable, and not something that is just a way station on the way to further conflict down the road. So those are my two caveats to that bigger picture. And it's clear that the international landscape looks different. And I think part of the problem we have is that, for a variety of reasons, our benchmark has become the 1990s, a moment of unipolarity at the end of the Cold War. And this has become the model by which we judge everything else. And
You mean
it's
in terms of stability and level of
and
warfare?
peacemaking and
Peacemaking.
peacemaking.
Okay.
Yes, in terms of war making and in terms of peacemaking.
So the
And
90s, which was an exceptional moment, and I mean most of our listeners probably know what that means, but just to put a point on it, that this is the first and brief window at the end of the Cold War when the UN was imagined to be robust and where Soviet US great power competition stopped being the only and dominant organizing principle of minor and mid-sized conflicts around the world.
yeah, you had a Security Council that wasn't completely ensnared in great power competition. I mean, we think of more recent examples, say with Syria or Ukraine, or even now with the conflict in Iran. The Security Council just doesn't function properly when great power interests are at stake. And That did look different in the 90s. And it's probably not the benchmark we should be thinking about, because I think it probably will mislead us.
Well, so
Uh,
were the 90s a better and more propitious climate for peacemaking in a way that artificially inflates our expectations of what we can accomplish through diplomacy?
there was plenty
Because
of war. I mean, the thing is that it's not as if there was a great track record for diplomatic achievement. I think people think about Dayton and the end of the war in the former Yugoslavia um, as as a kind of important benchmark. But you did have an international system that was trying to engage with conflict and post-conflict settings in novel ways that were, we saw it, in the aftermath of both the war in Yugoslavia and Rwanda after the genocide, an attempt to create international justice mechanisms. There was a boom in post-conflict studies, other hybrid tribunals in other parts of the world. Um, and It was a moment of ambition, the creation of the International Criminal Court, ideas like the responsibility to protect, yeah, and setting aside the merits of the idea, but just it was a more ambitious period where people and countries were thinking about institution building and the creation of new norms, and that's obviously not our moment, right? I mean, this is a moment of erosion of norms. Norms are under threat. Countries that at least had in the past paid rhetorical lip service to the international legal order or the idea of the international legal order, like the United States, are now actively revisionist. So it's an inapt comparison, I would say. We live in a very different world at the moment.
I'm Tanasi Kambanis at Century International. I'm talking to Michael Wahid Hanna about the changing nature of peacemaking and diplomacy. Michael, so you're saying that we shouldn't benchmark our expectations for today against the 1990s, and I want to say and then ask you. I mean, cynics which include a lot of the sort of the commentariat today, try to suggest that it's always been the same. It's ever been thus during the Cold War in the interperiod, and now with the U.S. and other imperial powers throwing around their weight and using proxy wars and so on to advance their interests and not really caring about the cost elsewhere. I don't hold that view, right? I think that, and maybe you agree, I don't know. I think there are really distinct differences between these periods, the Cold War period, that interregnum, which I would say from the end of the Cold War until 9/11, which triggered the sort of 9/11 wars, and then this current period. And the biggest difference, which I struggle to remember sometimes because I'm so depressed by what's going on, but in the 1990s, real people, serious people, actually believed uh, in concepts such as the UN having power to enforce diplomatic and other political agreements in a meaningful way. People believed that international peacekeeping was a real and viable way to end intractable conflicts. People believed that great and medium-sized powers would be restrained by the risk of making, of essentially destabilizing the world environment in ways that would cost them. So, by that logic, a aggressive United States or an aggressive Russia would self-limit in its military ventures because in its near abroad or elsewhere because it did not want to more profoundly and widely upset an international order from which it benefited. And these were concepts that I think affected state behavior for a time and nowadays do not, right? I mean, I can't put my finger on a moment when that changed. But in the 90s, it was believed by people who mattered that perpetual conflict was not a good idea, was destabilizing. That you couldn't just say like, oh, let the Balkans just fight forever, or let this or that war in some regional backwater fester. And today, I think it is a widely held assumption that wars that are widely destructive in their region can be viewed as strategically insignificant or as strategically manageable by other powers. And I think that's a big change that has maybe driven the disinvestment from diplomacy and peacemaking as a process even worth taking.
Yeah, I mean, again, I mean, the '80s saw the Soviet invasion well, late '70s saw the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Um, the United States fought a multi-year disastrous conflict in Vietnam, and I know you're not benchmark. You're thinking about at the kind of post-Cold War moment, um, and I do agree at root that there there was a different prevailing ethos at the time. Um, you couldn't imagine at that moment of the '90s, Russia waging an aggressive war in the middle of Europe. That something has happened, right? Um, I think the post 9/11 wars, it's something you just mentioned, play an important role here. I think the U.S. invasion of Iraq is a critical moment um, when when the United States decided to on spurious grounds to launch this war of regime change. I think that has had an effect in some inchoate way, but in an important way of beginning this period of erosion of norms around aggressive war. Um, and so that for me is an important set of moments. The spread of the global war on terrorism, in which um, various kinds of legal norms are eroded over time, and that's clearly had reverberations elsewhere, and we're still in that period. In fact, obviously, an accelerating period of normative backsliding. But I think a lot of it goes back to what happened in the aftermath of 9/11 in terms of the U.S. response.
So bring us up to speed with the kinds of peace talks or diplomatic initiatives that are underway today, and how connected they are to the realities on the ground, how significant they are. And again, in my mind, I'm thinking as reference, like in the at the end of the Cold War, we had a lot of U.S. Soviet diplomacy, the SALT talks, and there were, again, you can argue whether they were effective or not at managing peripheral conflicts, but there was a sort of known diplomatic framework between the major powers that were sponsors of most of the proxy conflicts around the globe. And in specific conflicts, there were, again, ongoing diplomatic processes. We had things like the Oslo process, which led to the perhaps misbegotten, but anyway, very significant Oslo agreements. So nowadays, I don't even fully feel like I understand. And so maybe I don't know if you want to limit yourself to the sort of Ukraine theater and the Iran theater. If you want to throw in one or more of the major African wars underway, just to give us a sense of the scope of types of talks that are happening, and in each of them, if you can address, are these talks really significantly connected to outcomes on the ground, and how different is that from the kind of traditional peacemaking model that we have in mind?
Yeah, I mean, you sort of begin to answer the question for me in the sense that, like ambitious arms control or various kinds of arms control, diplomacy. You can think back to the Reagan and Gorbachev, and the really ambitious ideas that were animating some of those discussions. The arms control agenda is a shell of its former self. It hardly exists at the present moment. And obviously, you mentioned the Oslo process, that the U.S. effectively inherited, and obviously as well quite ambitious, and probably the greatest failure of the United States in that period of opportunity. I put a lot. I think that was remains at the time was a solvable conflict, and the failure of the United States to impose a solution for a whole variety of reasons. But that failure is with us to date in major ways, and has and we're living with the consequences of that failure. But the point being, there was an ambitious diplomatic agenda around that idea of a two-state solution. There isn't that same kind of ambition at the moment. It's notable by its absence. The other thing that is very striking, and some of it is a function of just the aberrant nature of the Trump administration itself, but these endeavors were a whole of government enterprise. And you even saw this with more recently during the Obama administration with the JCPOA and the talks with Iran around its nuclear program. This was a massive undertaking that leveraged the variety of institutions that were implicated in these discussions, and that's a far cry from what we see now, in which institutions have been neutered, set aside, and diplomacy is the kind of the task of a few trusted advisors, and so we're operating. We're operating a very different environment, in which even the tools brought to bear upon diplomacy look quite different. You mentioned the two big diplomatic issues of the moment, in terms of obviously the war with Iran, efforts to end the war, Russia, Ukraine. For me, I think this discussion has to include Sudan, and in many ways, it is the kind of emblematic case study of diplomatic failure. It tells us a lot about our current moment, the ways in which the international landscape has changed, um, and the lack of, and this is not simply a Trump administration failure. This is something that also goes back to the Biden administration, but the lack of ambition and urgency to end conflict. But so I don't know how we want to parse out the rest of this discussion. But I mean, for me, those are the big cases of the moment.
Okay, let's not get too mired in the specific narratives here. Let's talk about. Let me ask you some of these uh, conceptual questions, and then you can bring in examples from these three or other peacemaking or failed peacemaking venues as we sort of go through the questions. First question I have is I want to do a sort of perspective check because a lot of my framing here is grounded in the U.S. perspective, right? So, as our listeners know, the U.S. has made this kind of radical shift from the kind of whole of government approach you just mentioned to one where Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law are often single-handedly, without staff, without diplomats, without technical experts, going around and having these kind of high level and in some ways very disconnected deal making talks in one theater or another, which is an entirely different, very sort of personalized, non-institutional approach to diplomacy. Have other parties to conflicts, have other states also changed their approach, or are we seeing the U.S. going into this personalistic kind of odd approach, whereas our Russia, Ukraine, outside powers that sometimes get involved in these talks, like Pakistan and China, African states, Gulf states, are they still doing what they used to do? Whatever their benchmark was in terms of sending professional diplomats or trusted advisors to the head of state, and real subject matter experts. Are they still doing that, and it's just the U.S. alone that has shifted to this personalistic approach, or is this part of a broader global shift away from state to state institutional peacemaking or diplomacy and towards this kind of ad hoc, strong men and their personal emissaries?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we haven't seen anything like the U.S. example elsewhere. Uh, but I think I would reframe it a little bit and say that the world is also adjusting to uh, this new U.S. environment. And so personalism is high on the agenda. And it's not just here, but and that's because other countries are trying to figure out how to deal with this new U.S. setup. And so there is a premium on personalism. There is a premium on personal connection, and you see this in the way that Trump relates to other countries and particularly other leaders. So I think for me there is that recognition, and that is a notable feature of the way in which other countries are now interacting with this United States. Deal making is being prioritized, at least rhetorically. You see this with the talks about critical minerals or other extractive industries being front and center in terms of the way that other countries are approaching the United States or trying to interest them in their affairs. So I think there's been an adjustment in terms of how others are reacting to this new setup, the kind of nakedly transactional aspects of it, and trying to use that to bring the United States uh, um, into those diplomatic settings. You saw this with the DRC recently as well. So it's become known in a sense that there are ways in which to trigger U.S. interests and attention.
Okay, so you said earlier in this conversation that fewer conflicts are being resolved through diplomacy than in the past. Um, to what do you attribute that? Is that a failure of diplomacy, or is that sort of diplomacy is neither here nor there in that it's because of a unfortunate shifting calculus by states, including the U.S. and Russia, but also many others who in the current era see the possibility of getting things they want through force and maximalism, and also see just a lower cost for violating norms because of the sort of habit of states violating norms over the last quarter century without much consequence.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both, right? I mean, it's not an either or kind of situation. Um, we have we have more states opting to pursue their goals through military means. We have proliferating conflict. That's clearly a big part of this. Once conflicts start, they're hard to end. Uh, um, but we also have failures of diplomacy and ambition in terms of how to carry out diplomacy. So I think these are both valid descriptions of our current moment. I don't think it's one or the other. I think you also have to tack on to that the sharpening of great power competition because it does then seep into the way that particularly the Security Council functions, and it becomes a further inhibiting factor in terms of being able to carry out effective diplomacy. We saw this
So,
over and over again with with the civil war in Syria. You see it writ small in terms of the inability to pass Security Council resolutions related to the war in Iran. But that sharpening great power competition is just an inhibiting factor to international diplomacy.
so Sudan, that's a case where I think you make a convincing argument that I want you to expand on a little bit. How could ambition, attention, and diplomatic involvement improve the outcome for that war, which is one of the most horrifying wars of our time and has somehow lurked on the edge of global attention despite being a real catastrophe for the people of Sudan?
It's, clearly the direst humanitarian situation in the world. That is not enough to, trigger action. That's nothing new. But I think underappreciated in terms of its strategic ramifications and what it could mean in terms of future conflict. So for me, this is a case where the United States um, doesn't quite fully grasp the import of this particular situation. It's an African conflict. It's contained. It's a humanitarian catastrophe, but not a strategic one, and hence not a top order priority for the United States. And so I think that's a mistake. I think the the increasing um, alignment and competition around around the war in Sudan among outside actors, particularly from the Gulf. This is I think the most important site of Saudi UAE friction. Maybe we could say Yemen as well, but for the moment, this is the most important site of Saudi UAE friction. Uh, it's it's unlikely that that situation, which I think is quite a problem for the United States in terms of how it goes about engaging with the Middle East after the war with Iran comes to an end. Um, I think it's very unlikely that this situation between the UAE and Saudi gets better without some positive movement on Sudan. So I think there are knock-on effects that the United States, I think, is not thinking through properly. And then there is the way in which this conflict has now spread, and you see alignments on a variety of issues in the Horn of Africa that could portend and it's not even a far-fetched scenario, but could portend a much bigger regionalized conflict. This is an area that abuts the Red Sea, a place that has grown in strategic importance at the moment with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and and I go back to the place where we started in terms of the human costs. So I think there's a lot to suggest that this should be much higher on the U.S. agenda, and the U.S. through its through Masad Boulos, special envoy, has has engaged a bit, has brought together the Quad, this format to talk about Sudan with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt, along with the United States, but it's not a top level priority. There is an absolute lack of focus and urgency, and the United States is sitting at a table hoping that its friends can stop their squabbling and come to an agreement. It's doing very little to try to make that happen in a kind of affirmative sense.
So, when I think about the kinds of even relatively recent historical examples of what might happen diplomatically in a conflict like this, I think, why isn't a middle neutral power like Norway tirelessly working behind the scenes to try to resolve the Sudan conflict? Why isn't a major power that has really real leverage over many of the players but is not connected, like China, hosting a set of talks that would include all the, involved in sponsoring powers? Um, why aren't the good offices of a small diplomacy forward country like Qatar or Oman? I think in this case, because of their proximity to the other players, maybe they specifically can't do that. But equivalent a Switzerland, or I don't know, another small country that has a robust diplomatic practice. Why are those types of things not on the table? Which they still might not work, right? But I mean, history says that these are always a long shot, and no one, I think, makes the argument that diplomacy kind of guarantees that you can resolve a conflict. But it is astonishing to me that is not that there hasn't been such an initiative the whole time on the war in Sudan. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I would say some of those initiatives exist. They are feckless because they don't have the means to exert any kinds of real pressure on the players that need to be pressured. So the Norwegians have been engaged on Sudan in the past. The UK is engaged. The African Union, the EU. There are a variety of players that are involved, but it gets to a separate issue about coordination and the kind of incoherence of diplomacy in which many actors are trying to play some role. But I think most importantly, um, none of the actors that are engaged so far are in a position to exert any kind of real influence on the principal players. You mentioned the Chinese, and it's very unlikely that China is going to become engaged in the Horn of Africa. It's far afield from where they see their interests really at stake. And I think it's telling in terms of the very limited role that China has played in the variety of post October 7th wars. It tells us something about how they think about the world and their role in it. And it is not the same conception of itself as a global player that the United States has and continues to have despite everything. Um, so I wouldn't expect China to jump into this role. It would be
Although it certainly
out of
could, right?
keeping.
I mean, it certainly could. I mean, we saw a glimpse of this when China took over those Baghdad talks a couple of years ago, and there was a brief moment where people thought, "Huh, maybe China is," but it turned out in that case, China was just willing and ready to host the signing ceremony for an agreement that others had already worked out, and it did not. It wasn't the prologue to a new chapter of where we're trying to serve this purpose, but it
But that's it.
has.
But on this point, the Saudi Iranian deal was worked out previously, and the reason that China was chosen to basically oversee the signing was as a pointed signal to the United States, right? I mean, it was done on purpose, delivering basically a deal that had already been agreed. So I think there was a lot of commentary that saw this as the beginning of a new moment of Chinese engagement in the region. And there is no Chinese backfilling for the United States. Whether, I mean, maybe that's the wise decision. But when people talk about, the emerging order after the Iran war, it's hard to figure a major role for China in those calculations. And so I don't put a lot of stock in the idea that China is going to be a key diplomatic player in that region, and by extension, the Horn of Africa.
So I'm mindful that we only have a couple of minutes left before you've got to go. So I think I want to close with this sort of bedrock question of whether like whether diplomacy is still worth investing in. And I guess the way I'm thinking this through is that we have a real eroded capacity to do diplomacy, which we need to reinvest in. And even if we do, that will be a necessary but insufficient condition because diplomacy still won't yield very much in an era where the United States, for example, is not really interested in peacemaking. So, diplomacy is eroded and in some cases broken. We need to fix it. If we do, we're still going to have to wait for the US and Russia and others to change their calculus and behavior if we want to actually see a sort of resumption of meaningful peace agreements and conflicts to get resolved instead of long-term managed. How do you think about this? And I guess I'll just want to end on whatever your grand thoughts are in response to that prompt.
Yeah, I think two thoughts come to mind. I mean, I think the first is there's a kind of institutional erosion that you point to that will require real reinvestment. And if there is speaking from the perspective of the United States, if there comes to be a moment of post-Trump reconstruction, and I use the word intentionally, but also more broadly. I mean, there has been this has been a period of deinstitutionalization, and diplomacy is part of that, and the tools by which you do diplomacy, right? I mean, emblematic cases, the shuttering of USAID. So there has been a deinstitutionalization in the United States, and the State Department as well, in terms of the people who have been pushed out, but also other organs of the U.S. government that engage in diplomacy. Like pieces of DOJ that deal with national security matters. Have seen a huge outflow of competent personnel. So for the United States, there should being the operative word, should be a period of trying to reinvigorate the institutions of state. And that is a much longer term process, I think, a necessary one, but not something that can be changed overnight, and not something that's going to be changed in the midst of this current dispensation. I think there is a second question about the here and now. And this is what we have to deal with. And there is conflict, and uh, and not just conflict, but the United States is a major driver of conflict. And so, how to engage with the United States and specifically the Trump administration, obviously, that engagement shouldn't be naive, but I think it is necessary to to still try to push at least incremental change or incremental improvement in terms of diplomacy. And there are at times openings. I mean, the United States is fitfully and inadequately engaged on Sudan, but that war is not going to end unless the United States is doing more. That's just the reality. I mean, it's not that I'm skeptic of multipolarity per se, but I do think multipolarity has been overstated, and the United States is still central to diplomacy on the variety of conflicts in the Middle East. Is central to the diplomacy, for better or worse, that's been happening around Russia, Ukraine, and likewise Sudan, as I mentioned, and not even to get into the variety of self-inflicted crises that are cropping up in Latin America. But it's hard to get around the United States still, even in this diminished aberrant form. So there has to be some accounting for the United States and the Trump administration, and some of that can be efforts to staunch the worst excesses. But there may be opportunities from time to time to engage on peacemaking, you know, partly because Trump is driven by his own sense of himself. His worldview about the international stage is Donald Trump, and so there might be opportunities to push forward peacemaking. There's obviously been a lot of opportunity for others to push forward war making. But the thing that combines all of that is Trump's own sense of himself and his sort of world historical role, which is really, I think, the kind of driving force of U.S. foreign policy. So I think there may still be opportunities to engage, but that is a difficult process, and no one should enter that naively.
Yeah, and I mean, as you were talking, it struck me, and maybe this is a banal observation, but I think it's important. Um, Trump's methods come to the world at a time when a lot of stakeholders believe that there's not really that much of a cost for them to pay for, perpetual or sort of constantly flaring wars, right? So in all the wars that we've talked about and the ones we haven't, multiple governments, militias, and sponsors of the conflict see very little risk to themselves, although plenty of risk to, affected populations of having these wars that go on and on. And I think that's I think part of diplomacy and peacemaking going forward has to be kind of diplomacy to stakeholder governments, host governments, countries, like diplomacy to the United States itself to restore a traditional view or convince people of a new view, if that's the case, that war actually is a bad idea for us, for whoever us is. That whether you're talking about the Emirates or the U.S. government or whichever other actor is helping fuel a conflict, to say like, hey, this might seem in the short term like it's no skin off your back if tons of people are dying in the Sudan or in Eastern Congo or in Ukraine or Iran or Lebanon or so on. But in fact, it is not good for you. It causes you all kinds of harm. So let us appeal not just to the moral sense that war is wrong, but to a self-interested idea that actually it's risky, it's bad, it's harmful. And so not just we want to support diplomatic efforts to end wars, but also we want to go back to a view that says that violent conflict is actually a public bad, not a cool way to try and pursue ambitious strategic goals.
Well, I'm happy to go on the record now to say that yes, war is bad. No, but
Very controversial.
I think the other piece of that is that it's hard to look at the U.S. track record militarily over the past 2 decades plus, and come away thinking that this is an excellent choice to pursue national interests. And yet, and yet, so that the kind of undimmed confidence in the utility of military force is surprising to me because the track record doesn't back it up. And that's not just the United States. I mean, you look at the Saudi-led war in Yemen, say, just to take another example, a complete disaster that ended up producing the kind of worst case scenario that the Gulf had feared when the war began, in terms of what the Houthis became. So there are so many examples. What Putin imagined was going to transpire following the full scale invasion of Ukraine, as something he thought was going to be a very short term affair. Uh, so there should be many cautionary tales, and yet uh, we see leaders continue to opt for this approach, and that should be slightly mystifying to all of us. So, you know, a little over a year ago, Donald Trump went to Riyadh and decried the foolish regime change dreams of his predecessors, and then not even a year later launched this war against Iran. So there is still, particularly in the United States, because of the kind of the professional competence, even still, of the U.S. military. There is this urge to use this tool, and yet looking at the kind of strategic track record, what has been the outcome of um, 25 years plus of non-stop war making in various theaters. It's hard to defend that track record as one that has been beneficial in strategic terms. And so I
Right.
think that's an important point, I think, to raise in terms of the ineffectiveness of this chosen tool.
And it's the one that we've used the most. The muscles we've been keeping in shape have been those war-making muscles. Michael Wahid Hanna, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You've been listening to Order from Ashes. I'm Thanasi Kambanis at Century International. I've been talking with Michael Wahid Hanna, the U.S. Program Director at International Crisis Group. Michael, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
See you next week on Order from Ashes.